Well, as we said, we're beginning a series in the book of Daniel this morning, looking at the first 6 chapters over the next few weeks. And today we're thinking of Daniel taking a stand. Now, there's no doubt that we in the West in the 21st century do not face the same kind of persecution as our brothers and sisters did in the first 2 centuries, when, as you will know, many of them were put to death in the Colosseum for their faith. Neither do we even face the same sort of physical persecution as many of our brothers and sisters face today in other parts of the world, though we should always be aware of that. But nevertheless, I don't think it's melodramatic to say that we do live in a time when in the UK, it's becoming just a little bit tougher to live and particularly to speak out as a Christian. Probably, I would say, the toughest time in my lifetime anyway to do that. And I wonder if you ever worry for yourselves, or if you're a little bit older, whether you worry for subsequent generations, for your children's generation, for your grandchildren's generation, as some of us are now very aware of. Whether you are concerned for them along the lines of this question posed by Chris Wright. How can the believer witness to his or her faith or preserve it at all in the midst of an alien and non-Christian culture? I wonder if that resonates with you at all, if that's something that you have ever been concerned about. Well, if so, I think the book of Daniel has much with which to reassure us and also much to challenge us as to how we can live in these days. And this first chapter of Daniel encapsulates something of his life history, as Andy was sharing with the children. Judah, the southern part of Israel, was besieged and taken control of by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And he decided that he would take some of the choice young men from the royal family and the nobility, and he would take them off into Babylon. And amongst them were Daniel and his friends. And as Andy was saying, they were probably very young men at the time. You know, think of Cam, possibly somebody round about his age. And they had grown up amongst the nobility in Israel, perhaps expecting to serve within government or even within the religious establishment of the people of God in the city of David. Instead, as teenagers, without warning, they suddenly find themselves 1,000 miles from home, no family around them, cast into a pagan world, indeed an enemy world. So when did this happen? Well, again, we don't have to guess about that. It's put out for us very specifically in verse 1. It happened in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. And we know from our history books that this was about 606 or 605 BC. And how long did he remain in that situation? Was this just a short, very painful experience, but one which he would get out of very quickly? Well, not at all. Look at the last verse of the chapter. And David remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. which again we know was 539 BC. And those of you who are very, very quick with your mental arithmetic can have a look at it now, and you'll see that that was a period of round about 67 years. And in fact, later on in chapter 10, we're told that the final prophecy that Daniel was given in the 3rd year of King Cyrus's reign. So we can see that Daniel remained in that position for 70 years, from being a teenager to being an old man. And we don't know for certain whether Daniel actually came with the first people who came out of exile and back to Israel, or whether he died there in Babylon. But virtually the whole of his life, from a teenager to his old years, he lived in the midst of that alien, pagan country. He outlived Jeremiah and Ezekiel. His ministry overlapped them at points, but he outlived both of them. He lived through the reigns of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar of the Babylonians. And then when they were defeated by the Persians, he lived through the of Darius and Cyrus of the Medo-Persians. Just think of that, through 4 reigns. He lived there in the court. He lived through this period, and throughout that period, he maintained the integrity of his faith. That's a tremendous reassurance, but I think it's also a tremendous challenge to us as well. And that was despite the fact that in those first 3 years, he was put through what I have called Nebuchadnezzar's cultural re-education program. We hear, don't we, of cultural re-education programs today. We hear of it in China in particular, don't we? And I hope it grieves our heart when we hear of that. But Nebuchadnezzar put Daniel and his friends through that as well. Now, why did he do that, and what did he do? Well, Nebuchadnezzar could be absolutely brutal. And as there are children in the congregation this morning, I won't go through some of the details of his brutality. But he was also a very astute leader. As he conquered various countries, he realized that keeping them under control would be much better if he could secure their support rather than simply suppressing them. And so what he did with Judah, as he did with many of the other countries who he conquered, he trained some people for his service. And he was very careful who he chose. He didn't bother with the older people, with those who were already in positions of importance and perhaps already had their ideas firmly fixed. No, he chose those who were young and who would be influential amongst their people. And he chose them at what he would see as an impressionable stage of life. And as Brian Russell described it, the design behind this was to turn potential rebels into compliant subjects. If he could convince them of the philosophies of Babylon, they wouldn't stand against them. They would become compliant subjects. So what did he do with these young men? What did he do with Daniel and his friends? Well, he saturated them in Babylonian culture. See, at the end of verse 5, they were to be trained for 3 years. And it would be a very, very intensive training. And what were they to be trained in? Well, at the end of verse 4, he was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So they were to learn all about Babylonian culture in a very intense way. So there's an encouragement. Perhaps those of you who are student age or thinking of entering it, yes, it is possible to follow a humanistic arts course or an evolution assumed science course for 3 years and remain faithful to the Lord. You can take it in, you can understand it, but not assimilate it or accept it. Another thing that was done to Daniel and his friends was that their very names and identities were altered. We see that in verses 6 and 7. They were given new names. And that was important. Given names were perhaps rather more important in those days than they are today. Those given names of Daniel and his friends all expressed their relationship to Yahweh. The suffixes of most of their names ended with L or R, and those were phrases that referred to Yahweh, to their God. And those names were replaced by names that were associated with Egyptian gods. Belshazzar, the god Bel from the Babylonians. Are there lessons for us in all of this? Well, I think one lesson for us is surely this, that we need to be aware and to recognize, perhaps more than we do, the tremendous pressure our young people face today to conform to the humanistic agenda with which they are confronted daily in the media and at school. Non-Christian values are there on their televisions, on the internet, all the time. And they're surrounded by it. Even in the adverts, you can see adverts for Renault car and McCain's chips, which present ways of living together as a family, which are not Christian ways. And in schools, well, as most of you know, I worked for 36 years in state education, so I'm not about to demonize schools and school teachers. And I possibly wouldn't go as far as Brian Russell when he said, young people in the 21st century go through an education so godless it takes a miracle of grace to survive it. I might feel that's a little extreme, but I know where he's coming from. There is simply a pervasive humanism which is there, sometimes not deliberately by those sharing it, but they've been brought up in it themselves. They've often never questioned it. And we need to be aware of that and recognize it. And perhaps in our families and in our churches, we need to do more to help them, to support them through this. Not to make them withdraw from it, but to help them in interacting with it and to know how to distinguish good and evil. It won't just happen by osmosis. We need to be helping them to understand what God says in all sorts of areas, not just in terms of sexual orientation, gender fluidity, but things like materialism and what constitutes success and well-being. Let's show them and teach them what God's word says about these things. But a point comes when Daniel decides that he needs to take a stand. And we see this in verse 8 with the but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. See that word resolve? It's something he absolutely determined. And we see that in verses 8 and 10. He went first of all to Azariah, the chief official, and asked him for permission not to have the king's meat and drink. But Azariah turned him down. He was very favorable towards Daniel, but he wanted to keep his own head. And he said, if I do this and you turn out weak and watery before the king, he'll have my head. As I said, Nebuchadnezzar could be brutal. That wasn't a metaphor. He meant it. He could have my head. But Daniel, just because he was once put off, didn't stop there. He had resolved. And so in verse 10 and then 11, verse 11, he goes to the guard who the chief official had given rule particularly over him and said, well, look, just give us a test for 10 days. I remember when we moved into this hall a number of years ago, we were told, well, yes, you can use the hall most of the time, but when it comes to the exam season, you'll have to go back into that dingy drama studio. Do you remember, some of you, when we were there? And we said to the school, well, give us a trial. The first time when it's the mock exams, let us put the exam tables out. And if we do it to the exam officer's satisfaction, can we stay in here all the time? And that's happened for the last 20 years or so. Well, Daniel wasn't put off at the first rejection. He tried and tried again. John Calvin said, it is a serious proof of our faith when we are not fatigued when anything adverse occurs. In other words, when we're not put off at the first sign. Daniel resolved. Well, you might say, okay, that's good, he resolved, but why did he take a stand at this point? He'd already gone through 3 years of a strange education, which would have included magic and astrology. He's already accepted his name being changed. Why make a stand over this? I rather like Chris Wright's comment on this. When we see how much he was prepared to swallow, it's hard to understand why he couldn't swallow royal meat and wine as well. You know, does it seem odd that this is where he made his stand? But I think that for Daniel, he recognized that neither the change of name or his secular studies had the power to turn his heart from God, to stop putting God first. But the king's food and wine might defile him. Notice that's the word he used twice, that this could defile him. How might that be? Well, we're not told for certain what his reasons were, but I think there are at least 3 possibilities. One is that this food may have been food that was offered to idols. And so he thought to take that food, knowing that it had been offered to idols, would defile him. But a second reason, which I think perhaps even more likely, is that in the ancient world, sharing food, sharing somebody's table, cemented a bond between you. In taking the king's food and wine, Daniel would be declaring his dependence and his loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar rather than to Yahweh. And a third possible reason is this, that he recognized the dangers to his heart of living a life of luxury. He was given this possibility. You can live as luxurious a life as possible here under my sway. And Daniel recognized that that had the danger of pulling his heart away from serving God. Well, we can't know exactly what the reason was. It could have been one of those, it could have been a combination of them. But most importantly, it was a matter of his conscience that he couldn't eat and remain faithful. And so, at risk to himself, he took a stand on what might seem a relatively small matter. But you know, Daniel could have never gone into that den of lions later without having stood for God in the smaller matter earlier. Neil was preaching very recently from Luke chapter 16, and this verse was in that verse. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Daniel took his stand on what might seem a relatively small thing early on in his life. It enabled him to stand later. The early church father Chrysostom said this: faithfulness in little things is a big thing. Faithfulness in little things is a big thing. And I'm sure we have all had examples, instances in our life where such a dilemma has come to us, where we feel we have to take a stand. I remember many years ago, I was on a course when I was at university, and we were away for 2 weeks in Greenwich working at Goldsmiths College on my drama course. And as it came towards the end of the first week, I suddenly realized that Sunday was coming up soon. I'd already sussed out where there was a decent church on the Sunday morning, and I'd said to myself, well, yes, I think I'll be able to get to the church service. But as we got nearer and nearer to the Sunday, I became convinced in my own heart, my own conscience, that I should be taking Sunday off from work, that I shouldn't be studying, that I shouldn't be rehearsing on that Sunday. And that was no easy thing to think about and think to say to my tutors and lecturers, because not only would it mean my saying, well, I don't want to do this, but obviously because of the nature of the course that I was on, it meant that other people who were working on the same scenes with me wouldn't be able to rehearse properly either. And of course, you can imagine the dilemma I felt as the week went on, and I tried to find all sorts of reasons to excuse myself for doing it. But I became more and more convinced in my own heart and conscience that the only thing I could do was to go to my lecturers and say, look, sorry, on Sunday, I won't be rehearsing, I won't be working. On the Saturday tea time, after we just had a tea, I just resolved myself to go and say something when the lecturer stood up and said, you've all worked really hard this week. I'm going to give you tomorrow off. The Lord was just so gracious to me as a young Christian, but he made me come to that point of decision where I would take my stand before, in a sense, he took away the pain of that from me. Now, we can't say that that will always happen. Sometimes we have to go through pain in taking a stand. But Daniel realized there was a point where he could say, I can do no more. Here I stand, I can do no other, as Luther would say later. And we do see how wonderfully his faithfulness was rewarded here. When they were checked after those 10 days, hardly seems much of a trial, does it? I can only believe that God, through his Spirit, must have told Daniel this. But in 10 days' time, he and his friends who ate the pulses looked the healthiest and the best nourished. When Nebuchadnezzar gave them their viva at the end of their 3 years, they were top of the class of the new intake. And when he started to work in the king's service, Nebuchadnezzar found him 10 times superior even to the old boys. Daniel took his stand, and God honored him in that. Well, there's one final thing I want us to see from this chapter, and this is it. It's an old cliche, but cliches are there because they're true, aren't they? Is this, that history is indeed his story. It's God's stories. And let me just look at 3 verses that particularly point that out. In verse 2, we read this: "And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands." Now, the secular history books would simply say Nebuchadnezzar had a really strong army. He was very, very powerful, and so he took over Judah. But of course, you'll find many examples in the Old Testament where the weaker armies of Israel were successful because God was with them. But in this instance, the people of Israel had been faithless to God for decades, if not centuries, and God said in the end that they needed to be chastened. And so the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Verse 9, Daniel found favor with the man Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials. Was that because Ashpenaz was a really kind man? Was it because Daniel was such a winsome character? No. Just like Joseph in prison in Egypt, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. And again in verse 17, with their testing at the end of the period, was it simply that Daniel and his friends were intellectually superior, either by their upbringing or how they had been, their genetics? No, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding. And of course, not just the knowledge and understanding of the Babylonian culture, but he enabled Daniel to understand visions and dreams of all kinds, which would come in extremely useful in the next years of his life. History is his story. God is behind all of this. And let's just go back to verses 1 and 21, the beginning and the end of this chapter, which we mentioned earlier. Verse 1 speaks about Nebuchadnezzar besieging Judah and taking control. Verse 21 says that now a man called Cyrus is the king. But of course, that was a different empire. The empire which had destroyed Israel in the first verse of the chapter has now disappeared from history by the last verse of the chapter. But Daniel and his people have survived and thrived. God is sovereign. And our history, your history, my history, is also his story. We may not be written up in books for people to read about in 2,500 years ago, if indeed the Lord tarries that long. But just like Daniel, he too is directing our ways and our circumstances. You sometimes get that sort of game or charade, don't you, where people ask, oh, who would you have liked to have been in history? Or when about in history would you have liked to have lived? Well, of course, it's an interesting sort of parlor game. I don't think people have parlors anymore, but, you know what I mean. But in reality, we should never wish to be anyone else but who you are, and to live anywhere else but where you are, or any other time, because this is where God has chosen us to live and to live for him. So let us resolve, like Daniel, in the place where God has put us, in the times when God has put us, to be faithful to our God. Let's pray.